The man sitting at the defendant's table looked exactly like what the prosecutor wanted the jury to see. His name was Walter Briggs, and he was 63 years old, wearing a sport coat that had been pressed carefully but was still 10 years out of style. His hands folded in front of him on the table with the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to take up too much space. He had worked as a custodian at the Millbrook County Public Library for 22 years. He had no criminal record, no savings account worth mentioning, no lawyer of his own until 3 days ago when a legal aid attorney had been assigned to his case and had managed one 40-minute meeting with him before the trial began. The charge was theft of public funds, specifically the diversion of donation money from the library's community literacy program over a period of 18 months. The prosecutor had financial records, a paper trail, and a signed statement from Walter's direct supervisor. What the prosecutor did not have, what no one in that room yet understood, was what was about to walk through the door. When it opened, the sound of 3 sets of heels crossing the marble floor brought every head in the courtroom around. 3 women in their late 20s and early 30s entered in a line, each carrying a briefcase, each dressed with the unmistakable precision of people who had prepared for exactly this room. The legal aid attorney at Walter's table went pale. The prosecutor frowned. Walter Briggs looked up from his folded hands, and something happened to his face that the court reporter would later describe to her husband as the most complicated thing she had ever watched a human being feel. Because Walter knew those 3 women. He had known them since they were 7, 9, and 11 years old, shivering behind a dumpster in the rain. And they had not come to watch him be convicted. They had come to take the whole case apart with their bare hands. Walter Briggs had been 40 years old when his wife Patricia died of a heart condition that the doctors had identified 2 years too late, and that the insurance company had covered 2 years too little. He had spent the following 3 years paying down medical debt on a custodian's salary, selling the car, downsizing the apartment, working weekend shifts at a convention center to cover the gap. He was not a man who asked for help. He was the kind of man who believed that the appropriate response to difficulty was to work harder and speak less about it. He had grown up in eastern Kentucky, in a house where that belief was passed from father to son, the way some families pass down furniture. By the time he arrived at Millbrook County and took the library job, he had been alone for 3 years and had built a life that was quiet and orderly and required very little from the world and gave it very little back. That changed on a February evening when the temperature had dropped to 17 degrees and he was taking the recycling out through the library's back exit and found 3 girls in the narrow gap between the building and the utility fence. The oldest was 11 and her name was Destiny. The middle one was 9 and her name was Corrine. The youngest was 7 and her name was Petra. Their mother had died 6 months earlier and their father had been incarcerated 2 months after that. And the foster placement they had been assigned to in a town 30 miles away had broken down in a way that none of them would describe in detail for several years. They had been on their own for 4 days. Destiny had kept them fed with what she could find and moving during the day, and hidden at night. She was 11 years old, and she had been doing this for 4 days, and she was the one who looked Walter directly in the eye when he opened that door and asked him plainly if he was going to call the police. Walter stood in the cold for a moment looking at the 3 of them. He thought about what calling the police would mean. Another placement, another disruption, another institution making decisions for children who had already had every decision made for them by people who did not know their names. He thought about his empty apartment and his empty evenings and the specific weight of a life that has stopped producing anything worth keeping. He told Destiny he was not going to call the police. He told all 3 of them to come inside. He gave them the lunch he had packed for himself and sat with them in the break room while they ate and did not ask them questions they were not ready to answer. That night they slept on the couch and the floor of his apartment, which was 8 blocks from the library and contained 1 bed, a small television, and 3 houseplantes that Patricia had loved and that Walter had kept alive out of a loyalty he could not have explained. He had intended it to be temporary. Temporary became a week became a month became the rest of their childhood. He never formally adopted them. The paperwork and the legal exposure were beyond what his salary and his understanding of the system could manage. But he was consistent and present, and they were there every morning when he left for work, and every evening when he came home, and that was what mattered. He helped Destiny with her reading, which was behind where it should have been, and within 2 years she was the strongest reader in her class. He took Corrine to the library on Saturdays and let her spend hours in whatever section she chose, which was always science, always medicine, always the books with diagrams of how the body worked and how things went wrong inside it and how they could be fixed. He bought Petra a second-hand journal and a set of colored pens and encouraged her to write down what she observed about people, which was considerable, because Petra at age 7 already had a quality of attention that most adults never develop. He was not a perfect man. He was tired often and short sometimes, and there were evenings when the weight of what he had taken on felt crushing, and he sat at the kitchen table after the girls were asleep and stared at the wall and wondered how he was going to make the next month work. But he was there, every morning and every evening and every parent-teacher conference and every fever and every nightmare. He was there. They grew up and they left, as children do. Destiny went to a state university on an academic scholarship, and then to law school on another one. Corrine went pre-med and then medical school, and then a residency in internal medicine at a hospital in Philadelphia. Petra went to journalism school and then to a non-profit that specialized in investigative reporting on systemic failures in public institutions, which was, of all the things she could have chosen, the most precisely suited to what was about to happen. Walter watched them leave one by one and felt each departure as a specific and earned grief, the way you grieve a good thing that has concluded rather than a bad thing that has been lost. He continued at the library. He was present for every moment they returned for holidays, phone calls, the occasional weekend visit. He never told them what it had cost him. He did not think of it as having cost him anything. He thought of it as the thing his life had been for. The charges arrived on a Monday morning in October, delivered by 2 men from the county auditor's office who asked Walter to come with them and who were polite but not warm. Walter cooperated fully, which his legal aid attorney would later describe as both his most admirable quality and his most significant tactical error in the early stages of the investigation. He answered every question honestly, and without a lawyer present, and did not understand that he was constructing a record that a skilled prosecutor could arrange into a story that looked very much like guilt. The literacy program donation fund had in fact been short by $11,000 over 18 months. The transactions had been run through an account that Walter had access to because he was one of 3 employees authorized to accept cash donations at the front desk. The other 2 employees were the program director, a man named Gary Ellison, and an assistant director who had resigned and moved out of state 4 months before the investigation began. Gary Ellison had been with the library for 6 years and was known in the community as a tireless advocate for literacy programming. He had also, as Petra would discover, been quietly managing a gap in his personal finances through a series of small diversions from the donation account, each one individually small enough to appear as a data entry error, collectively large enough to matter. Walter had not known about any of this. Walter did not know how to perform an audit. He was a custodian. He mopped floors and fixed small maintenance issues, and accepted occasional cash donations at the front desk, and recorded them on a paper log the way he had been trained to do. The paper log was accurate. The digital records, which Gary Ellison controlled as program director, were not. None of this was apparent from the summary documents the prosecutor had been given. None of it was apparent to Walter's legal aid attorney, who had not had time to look closely at the underlying records. None of it would have been apparent to anyone, except the specific person who had spent 4 years investigating exactly this kind of institutional fraud at exactly this level of sophistication. Petra had been working on a piece about public library funding irregularities in 3 Ohio counties when Corrine called her. She had Walter's case documents in her hands 48 hours later. She identified Gary Ellison's pattern in the transaction records in approximately 6 hours and spent the next 4 days building a documentation trail that she then handed to Destiny, who spent a further 3 days converting it into a legal argument structured for presentation in a courtroom. Corrine flew in from Philadelphia not because she had a legal role to play, but because she was not going to let Walter sit in that room alone. When they walked through those courthouse doors, they had with them a complete forensic reconstruction of the 18-month transaction record, a signed statement from the assistant director who had been located by Petra in Indianapolis, and who had left specifically because she had noticed the discrepancies, and had been told by Ellison that she was misreading the records, and a comparative analysis of Ellison's personal bank deposits against the library's donation shortfalls that correspond. Destiny stood in front of the jury and did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. She simply laid the documents in order and walked the jury through them the way Walter had once walked her through a paragraph she could not make sense of, patiently, from the beginning, without assuming they were foolish for not having seen it already. The prosecutor's case had been built on the assumption that Walter had neither the resources nor the people to mount a real defense. That assumption was the only thing in the room that turned out to be entirely correct, and it was also the thing that made no difference at all, because the resources and the people had arrived anyway. The verdict took the jury 4 hours. Not guilty on all counts. Gary Ellison was arrested at his home 2 days later based on the materials Petra had turned over to the county attorney's office. Walter sat on the courthouse steps in the October afternoon with his sport coat still pressed and his hands no longer trembling, and watched the leaves moving in the trees along the street with the expression of a man who is trying to locate the correct feeling for a moment he had not allowed himself to anticipate. Destiny sat beside him on his left. Corinne sat beside him on his right. Petra sat on the step below them and looked up at him with the direct, observing quality she had possessed since she was 7 years old, in a library break room eating a sandwich that belonged to someone else. Walter said he did not know how to thank them. Destiny told him that was not a thing he was allowed to say. She said that everything they had, every skill, every credential, every hour of preparation they had put into the last 2 weeks, had been built on a foundation he had laid in an apartment 8 blocks from a public library with 1 bed and 3 houseplints, and a salary that should not have been able to stretch as far as he had stretched it. She said the word thank you did not apply in any direction in this particular situation. Walter looked at the trees for a while. Then he said he supposed she was right, and that Patricia would have liked her very much. Corinne took his hand and held it. Petra wrote nothing down, which was the only time anyone who knew her could remember that being true. In the months that followed, Petra's piece about the structural vulnerabilities in public institution financial oversight ran in a national publication and was read by a great many people. The county library system conducted a full audit. 2 other institutions in the region identified similar patterns, and 1 additional arrest followed. Walter returned to work because he wanted to, because 22 years of floors and carts and the particular quiet of a building full of books had made it his in the way that a place becomes yours not through ownership but through presence. The community that had whispered about him in October found other things to talk about by January, which is what communities do, and Walter did not hold it against them because holding things against people had never been part of how he was built. He had dinner with Destiny and Corinne and Petra on the last Sunday of every month. He participated in the group text Petra had set up with the careful, deliberate typing of a man who had learned to use a smartphone at 61 and was not going to be embarrassed about how long each message took him to compose. He was not alone. He had not been alone, he understood now, for a very long time. He had simply been a man who had forgotten to count what he had because he had been too occupied with giving it away. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the things we give without keeping score are exactly the things that come back to us when it matters most. Subscribe, because every week we are here with the people who prove that kindness is never wasted, even when it takes 20 years to find its way home.